Hello and welcome to another episode of the Hardcore Soft Skills Podcast. This is Yari Caro. Stress management is a skill employees value in leaders and team members. Stress is always there, but when it starts to take over our lives, impacting our productivity and most importantly, our relationships, it's time to take action and learn how to manage it. When looking for an expert to talk about the topic, I figured having a mental health specialist will be ideal. But when that mental health specialist is also a combat pilot who has worked in conflict zones, I realized we can learn a lot more. Dr. Janell MacAulay is a U.S. Air Force veteran and has managed human performance under high stress for over 2 decades. After I recorded this episode, I listened to it again at least twice, since there was so much information of value she shared about mindfulness and how, with simple techniques, we can start managing stress effectively. This episode is filled with essential information. So let's listen. Welcome, Dr. MacAulay, to the podcast. Appreciate your time. And I'm going to read your bio here. You're a combat veteran and have been serving for 20 years in the U.S. Air Force as a pilot in particularly conflict zones as well. And you were the first leader to introduce mindfulness as a proactive performance strategy within the U.S. States military. We're going to talk about that. That's very interesting. Also, you specialize in high performance under stress with a holistic approach. You are currently working as a consultant with the Department of Defense, government sector, and corporate in terms of leadership and human performance, and the co-founder of Warriors Edge, which I want to talk about as well today. And also, you're a graduate of the U.S. Air Force Academy, master's degree in kinesiology from Pennsylvania State University, and a PhD with work on the strategic health and human performance. And not only that, you're also a wellness educator, yoga instructor. Your resume here, your information is quite impressive. So definitely looking forward to chat today.
Oh, thank you so much. I think, one aspect of my background and my resume I like to make sure people are aware of, a lot of that was done underneath one organization, right? Like I was in the Air Force for 20 years and it's such a great opportunity for us to explore different phases of our careers. And, inside one organization, I was able to lead people, fly airplanes, command teams, get educated, and then experience like international missions and diplomacy. And so it was a great career that I had, taking advantage of all the opportunity that the organization has to offer.
Now, why did you decide to join the military? What made you want to be an Air Force and an Air Force pilot?
That's actually a great question. If most people that would have known me or knew me back in high school, I definitely was a ballerina and a gymnast. And especially back then, in the 1980s, where there were huge stereotypes for what women and men could do. And in fact, society did put a lot of barriers on what women could do back then as well. And so there was a reality behind it. And I think the interesting thing was, despite all of that, my dad would tell anyone that would listen that I was going to grow up to be a submarine warfare commander or a combat pilot. And it was interesting to me because as, 7, 8-year-old, right? Like looking up to him and listening to him say this to strangers, I kind of grew up not knowing that there were barriers on the things I could do as a woman. And not even thinking that, I couldn't be a ballerina and a combat pilot, right? Like those two things needed mutually exclusive. Like that just wasn't even in, my vocabulary, and the messaging my parents used with me was very powerful in that way. So that's part of how I ended up on the path. My uncle was also a helicopter pilot for the Marine Corps, and we grew up in Southern California, really in a family of public servants. Both my grandfathers served, my uncle served, my dad was a police officer and my mom was a nurse. So I think I grew up just knowing I was going to serve my community in some way. And the military just kind of made sense. The more I looked into it, especially the Air Force and the opportunity that would be available to me, whether I wanted to be a doctor or a pilot, I could reach those goals, which I ended up doing. So I think that the Air Force was the right, course and path for me at the time. And it was kind of set me on this trajectory.
Now, while in the military, and I'm sure you had plenty of experience there managing all sorts of stressful situations, how did you approach it during that time while you were in the military or in any combat zone? How do you approach all these stressful situations?
I think a lot of it comes from, the way I was raised. I had a lot of drive. I understood hard work. I understood, grit and commitment, those types of things. I've always kind of been the type of person that if someone said no to something I wanted to do, I just found a different way to get to yes, or a different type of yes, right? And that is, by that was kind of like part nature and part nurture, right? Like of what I was kind of grown up, how I grew up. But what I realized about halfway through my career is that hard work and hustle really only takes you so far. And so my parents' teachings were really incomplete. And what I was missing was really the idea of how my mindset and how I could actually train my mind to be better in those high stress situations, right? I didn't have to just gut through them. And what I realized over the course of a military career, and I think most people today are realizing, is that the repetitive exposure to those stressful environments is exhausting, right? You can keep it up and you're in the hustle and you're measuring yourself on the success that comes to you because of that, right? I hustle more, I get a promotion. I hustle more, I win an award. I hustle more, right? I'm getting the things I want to get out of life. However, there's a sustainability piece that we're never really taught or built into the pathway. And that's what I found to be lacking in my career, is how it manifested itself was that I was just living my life stressful moment to stressful moment to stressful moment. And I was telling this internal dialogue where I would say things like, well, as soon as I'm done with this course that I'm taking, or this upgrade to instructor, or whatever it was, I will finally start taking care of myself. Or as soon as I'm done with this command position or this big project that I was given, then I'll finally start paying more attention to my family. But then what happens is you get through that stressful time, and then there's another stressful metric or something right behind it, right? That you're like, okay, well, as soon as this one's done. And in the meantime, you're mind wandering through your life. You're only seeing the stress and the work, and you're missing the opportunities for joy. And I think that's what causes burnout. That's what causes this physical, emotional, psychological exhaustion that many people experience. And also, it impacts our ability to be high performing in stressful and high pressure situations that, for the fact of the matter, are not going away, right? There's nothing about life in general that's going to all of a sudden sometime calm down and say, you're never going to have to deal with pandemics or, deadlines or, right? Even just the stress. What I was noticing is that the stress I could feel in a combat zone, right? I'm getting shot at, that it's dangerous, I'm in charge, all the pressure's on me. The way my body would manage stress or how stress was manifested in my physiology in those moments was the same physiology that I would experience if I was taking my kids to school and pulling up in the carpool lane, right? To drop them off, and just that stress and chaos and overwhelm was the same. And so if I learned how to get a control of it, I could change a whole bunch of aspects of my life.
Now, did that came about while you were in the military, that study deciding to kind of take a step back and be more either mindful? Is that when you decided to approach that while in the military?
I did. It was about 13 years in my career. It was my first opportunity to go, or actually, I guess my second opportunity to go back to school. And I literally remember just sitting there in this, the seats of the big auditorium as they were saying, hey, welcome to Air Command and Staff College. During this year, you're going to learn all this stuff, blah, blah, blah. And I just remember sitting there thinking, I don't even want to do this. I don't even know what I want to do anymore, but I am not happy. I am not in a place where I feel like I can continue to serve and be high performing and be the leader that the people around me, to include my family, right? My children and my spouse needed of me. And so instead of there was some kind of, mental health skills that I needed to build for myself to build mental strength in those moments, because it is really easy for us to go in kind of like a depression, right? About like, where am I in my life? This is kind of the midlife, right?
Yeah.
Where you're like, am I doing the things I wanted to do? And am I making the difference that I had intended for out of my life? And I just remember thinking there's got to be more joy and happiness, because I was getting everything I wanted, right? Like I was super successful from the outside. So why was I not happy? And that's really what pushed me toward this journey of exploration into human performance. And, you know, I needed to answer the questions out of self-necessity so that I could survive the next 7 years of what was, you know, hopefully going to be the rest of my military career. And I realized as I looked around at my peers, they were all suffering from the same thing. The people I led were suffering from a lot of this. So I figured, well, let me deep dive and figure out how to solve this problem for everyone. And what I found, like the core of what I found, is that we can train 3 things as human beings: our body, our craft, and our mind. And the entire time I'd been in the military, I've trained my body, I've trained my craft and my specialty. I've never trained my mind, nor had anyone even talked about formalized ways to train our minds. So that's where I really dug into the research, found mindfulness as the key skill set, right? There's a whole bunch of skill sets. And in my programs, I teach 16 different skill sets for how to train your mind. But that's really where it came from.
What is the first step that some of us that are on in a constant stress and going, what is the key step that we could just get started a little bit and then kind of cultivate that kind of mindfulness?
Yeah, the thing I like to tell people to kind of start off with is this idea that our breath is very powerful. And we shallow breathe most of our lives. We only use about 20% of our lung capacity. And when we learn how to really like take deep breaths and take really deep exhales, what we do is, if you think back to like, and there's so much physiology I can go into, so I'm going to just talk about this at the surface, but back when we were, you know, our ancestors were running from saber-toothed tigers, right? As soon as they ran away and got into a safe place, what was the first thing they did? They would take a big exhale, right? And that exhale signaled, like in the mind-body connection, it gave our brains the signal that, hey, we're okay, right? We're safe. And so there's an ancient and primitive mechanism tied to our breathing that gives us the ability to stay calm, that gives us the ability to focus, that gives us the ability to transition thoughts inside our mind to say, we are okay. And many times when we're in high stress situations, we shallow breathe. The stories inside our head tell us this moment's too big for us. I can't do this. You know, you make up elaborations about what is going on right in front of you, which is really rarely tied to reality. So when you learn to tap into your breaths, that's like the first most powerful exercise we can do for ourselves. And it's something that we just aren't ever taught in the military. In fact, we're taught, like, if you stop and slow down, like, you're doing it wrong, right? Like, you're not in the hustle, you're not working hard enough. And I call it the competitive stress environment that we live in, where we almost measure our success and our value based on how stressed out we are. And I think we need to change that, because when you look at the science, when you look at the evidence of what works, it is taking steps back. It is taking deep breaths. And so once we learn how to tap into our breath, I think it can be very powerful for many of the things we do in life.
You have trained this to the military while you were in the military then, and how has been the reception when you try to establish these particular practices?
Well, so I'll answer this in 2 parts. The first was, anytime you try to do something different that really pushes against the norm, especially in such a dramatic way, right? Like, I'm telling people, slow down to speed up your professional success. And I'm telling people, you know, tap into your breath. And to be honest, it's very difficult for a large organization like the Air Force or the military to understand, because they're like, well, how much does it cost? And I'm like, well, technically it's free because it's your breath, right? It's free. Okay, well, what do we have to equip everybody with? Well, you don't have to equip anybody with anything because it's their breath. Like, they already have it. Like, it's freaking always with us. And so I think just like an acquisition of how you teach people how to train their minds has been very difficult for the organization to understand. And it goes against like the norm, right? The hustle mentality that we've built. So that's been the first challenge. And then secondly, you know, a lot of people see it as a soft skill that's not going to give the military, you know, an edge. And I like to say that it keeps us on our edge, right? Like, it is really a difficult skill, right? Like it may seem soft because it is tied, mindfulness is tied to our breathing. It's something that you do, you can sit there and exercise your mind, but you could also be walking or outside in nature and be exercising your mind. And there's nothing that you show for it, right, on the surface. So that's why it's difficult as well. There's no mental gym, right? Like if I was selling gym equipment, people would understand that, but a mental gym, right, inside your mind, you can't see it, you can't touch it. And the thing about mindfulness is that it is a difficult skill. Like breathing usually is not the hard part, right? Like learning how to breathe is just the mechanism for cultivating presence and awareness so that we live more on the play button instead of living inside what I call the iPod in your head, right? Fast forward and rewind, especially under stress. So that's really like what I think is the challenge, is getting them to understand that mindfulness is the skill that will keep them on the edge of their performance. And it really is the antidote to our stressful environments and the highly virtual world we live in today, right? With our digital devices, with 24/7, no work rest cycles. I think that learning how to train our minds will help us excel in those operational environments of today's conflicts.
Yeah, that's great. So having that mindfulness actually makes us better performers, better at our any particular task. That's great. And I wanted to ask you, because I saw that you have shared something on in the network in LinkedIn about PTSD, and I want to know a little bit about what are the risks of not taking mindfulness like seriously, or like not taking a pause, or not starting to realize that these are necessary skills.
Yeah, so I think one thing that is certain is that combat environments are ripe with psychological and emotional trauma, right? Like you are not just expected to do your job when everything's amazingly calm. You're expected to do your job in a combat environment where it's not, right? Like where everything possible could go wrong. You're still expected to do your job. That is the military mission at its core. And so there's some exposure to psychological and emotional trauma when that's your job. Mm-hmm. And so what we found in some research is that, there is so much stress leading up to like a deployment. And there's a research study that found that stress actually degrades individuals' cognitive capacity, like their ability to focus, to pay attention. They have more mind wandering, their memory is decreased, their mood levels are low. All those things happen just because of the stress leading up to a deployment. So when we send our service members out into the area of operations around the world many times, right? And we have research studies to back this up. They're degraded from a mental state because of the stress prior to their departure. What we found is that if those individuals during that pre-deployment interval were given mindfulness training and they correspondingly practiced across the time period. So it's not just like a one-shot, 10 weeks before you leave on a deployment and then you're going to be amazing. It's across those 10 weeks, right? You regularly practice mindfulness. What we found from the research is that mindfulness can protect their brains from that degradation.
Oh, wow.
Right? So then they leave on their deployment at their baseline performance from a mental standpoint. Then what we found is if it's just regular everyday stress, not like a pre-deployment interval stress, we found that mental capacity could go up and increase, right? Improving mood, decreasing mind wandering, improving memory, improving focus, all of those things. And so that's one of I equate it to like an immunization, right? Like we want our military members to be protected no matter where they go in the world. So we give them shots, right? To say, hey, you're going to be exposed to potentially some kind of dangerous disease. We're going to give you a shot to protect you from it. Yeah. We know combat zones are ripe for stress, overwhelm, psychological and emotional trauma. Now we know giving them like a shot of mindfulness, right? And teaching them that skill set before they leave can not only protect them as they go, but also protect them for what they're going to experience in those environments.
Wow. When you have trained people that are not in the military, that are people in like corporate America or anywhere in the world, what are some key things that you think, or a key thing that they could learn to do now, or any key advice that you have for those people that are not necessarily preparing to go to a combat zone, but they have their everyday struggles, not as, it's much more significant, I'm sure, in the combat zone, but in terms of the daily struggles that we have.
Well, like I mentioned, I noticed in my own life that whether it is a combat zone or even some of the stress we experience in our daily life or as a leader, right, in a boardroom and the corporate environment, there's a lot of pressure and stress on those decisions and profit margins and different things. And so stress manifests itself the same way. So if you learn how to, get a hold of it and then optimize your performance in those stressful environments, it will translate to other aspects of your life. And so really, I mean, I like, and I tend to focus a lot of my work on high stress occupations. So police and law enforcement and first responders, military, but the concepts of training your mind are the same. And really all of us should be doing it. I mean, one of the biggest benefits of the practice of mindfulness in particular as the foundational skill set of training your mind is that we are more aware, like self-aware. We're more aware of our thoughts, feelings, and emotions and how we're interacting with our environment, which helps us make more rational decisions across the spectrum of our behaviors. And then additionally, what it does for us is it helps us emotionally regulate. Can you imagine if our entire adult population was more emotionally regulated, like how better we would be able to relate to each other and have, rational and constructive discussions instead of everybody just always being emotional. I think it's valuable for everyone.
Yes, and in these times now that we're in very difficult times, that kids at home studying, or any other key piece of advice that you have for those in this particular times that we could apply for trying to manage the everyday?
Yeah, I would say everybody should do a little bit of, mindfulness obviously is one of the key skill sets, but in addition to that, I think we should all really sit down, self-reflect, and answer some questions for ourselves. Like, how do we define success? What do we value in life? What is our purpose, right? Understanding the answers to those questions, and also understanding that there's no one right answer. It's just your answer. You just have to do the work to figure it out for you. And once you answer those questions, life decisions become a whole lot easier, right? And the way we interact with the stress that comes at us can really significantly change. And so that's the other thing I work on with people, is how to figure out like these self-discovery questions and what are the answers to them and how they can help their everyday lives. One thing in particular with that is, like, I have a mantra, right? I have a life philosophy, which is rooted in my purpose and my values and how I define success. And what that reminds me of every day is to just live where my feet are planted. Right? So that when I'm at home, I'm at home. And when I'm at work, I'm at work. And I have these transitions I use with my mindset to shift and say, hey, I'm transitioning to work now. Here's how I set my mindset up for that. Now I'm transitioning to home. And maybe sometimes it's just by coming out of your office, right? Because you're working from home. But I think where we waste a lot of mental productivity is when we spend all our time at home worried about work and all our time at work worried about home. And it can revitalize your performance and your efficiency if you start just thinking to yourself, live where my feet are planted, or be present now even, right? Like having some kind of mantra that will help.
Wow, definitely practices that I'm going to start implementing today. Now, if people wanted to get more training or just getting in touch with you, what's the best way to contact you, or just to find out more about the training that you provide?
Yeah, so I have a website, janellmacaulay.com, and people can go to the website and check out some of the programming I offer to corporate audiences as well as military and law enforcement, first responder, healthcare groups. Additionally, you mentioned my Warrior's Edge program. So that's my partnership with Coach Pete Carroll of the Seattle Seahawks, and then Dr. Michael Gervais, who's a high-performance sports psychologist. So the three of us kind of combined our expertise in our various fields, especially on the forefront of mental skills training, and developed the Warrior's Edge curriculum and program. So really, it's offered as a live training workshop where an elite military operator and an Olympic athlete teach 16 principles of mindset. We also have an online digital self-paced course that you can sign up and take. So you can learn more information going to competetocreate.com or competetocreate.org/Warrior's Edge. Or just a Google search, and then they can find out more information about that. And then I'm on all of the social media platforms. So like you reached out to me on LinkedIn, right? Any of your listeners can do that as well to find out more information, or to contact me for different programming or questions.
Great. I appreciate this. This has been a gem of a lot of the good information, especially now that we're going through some very difficult times. And this is advice that people really need to hear. So I truly appreciate that, bringing your expertise to this podcast. And I look forward to just continuing getting to know more about the information that you share. So thank you so much, Dr. MacAulay.
You're very welcome. It was my pleasure to be your guest.
Thank you for listening to another episode of the Hardcore Soft Skills Podcast. If you like what you've heard and think others may benefit, please share this episode and give it a 5-star rating and review on Apple Podcasts to help others discover it. Remember, you can also listen via Spotify and our website, hardcoresoftskillspodcast.com, where you can also sign for the newsletter to receive updates and additional resources about the skills we have learned so far. Thank you for listening, and see you next time.